Hi, I wanted to chat with you a little bit about best practices for doing read-alouds with kids. Um, I wanted to have you keep in mind a couple of big ideas before you get started. One is that the purpose of doing a read-aloud is that we want to get kids into the book. We want them to feel like they are connected with the story, like they are feeling it themselves, they are interacting with the character, they understand where it's taking place and the plot. So in order to do that, we need to do a few things before we begin reading. And this may take a little preparation on your part. You'll definitely need to read the story first, maybe a few times. Probably need to practice it a little bit yourself. And then you need to plan a little bit for what you think are the most important concepts that you want to bring out in the story with the kids, and probably some vocabulary words you might want to target as well. You also want to think about some questions that you're going to want to ask them throughout the story, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So the purpose really is to make sure that we're getting them into this story, to help them visualize and engage with, maybe even smell the same smells and feel the same feelings and touch the same things that are happening in the story. So that's really one of the biggest purposes. Another purpose for why we do this and what our big idea is for reading aloud is that we want to make the experience interactive with kids. So maybe back in the olden days, a read aloud was where a teacher or an adult read to you, and that can be an enjoyable experience, certainly, where you just relax and sit back. But our kids have a tendency perhaps not to be as actively engaged in the story as we'd like them to be, so we need to make sure that we're engaging them throughout the book. So what we need to do is we need to, in order to make it interactive, we need to ask questions. And I'd like to have you try to do that at least every few pages throughout the book. We want students to do maybe motions or maybe make sounds if they hear the same word over and over again. Some books will lend themselves well to that, and some you can't really do that. So just make your own discretion about that. I've got a book that I'm reading aloud called Thank You, Amu, and there's knocking. So of course I tell them ahead of time, whenever we say knock, knock, make sure you knock on something like a table. So we kind of prepare them for that. Then if a phrase is repeated in the story over and over again, you can practice it ahead of time with them and tell them that it's coming and you want them to say it with you. So that's another way to help them become interactive and engage in the story in a sort of physical way. The other thing is I've got a couple of books that I actually sang with them because they're songs. So we sang the book and I encouraged them to sing with me. So if you feel comfortable doing that, please feel free. We're not judging your singing abilities. It's all about the kids. So that's the second thing, making sure that we're interacting with them throughout the book. It's not just I'm reading to you and you can just sit back and wander in your brain. We want them to be engaged. Okay, and the third thing is that we want to encourage comprehension. This is one of the reasons we're doing this. Comprehension vocabulary, really. So we're going to be asking questions throughout the story that are open-ended. So basically, you want to ask any question that does not have the answer yes or no to it. Okay? If you can think of a question that does not have the answer yes or no, you're on the right track. So often the questions that start with the W's, what, who, when, where, and then how, those are good questions to start with. And if those are the questions that you can begin with, those are great. Start with those kinds of questions. Be careful not to always ask what questions, because those tend to be more things that are just kind of easier to answer. We want to get them deeper, and I'll give you some examples of those. So we want to be asking them questions throughout the book. The questions should help them think deeply. So we want to also give them maybe a minute, okay, maybe a minute's a little long, but some lag time so they can think before we expect their answer. Now, if you're doing an interactive experience lesson with your students, then you can actually give them the time to think it takes them, however long it takes them to think about that answer. If you're doing a video like I'm doing, a read aloud video, I just pause for a few seconds and as if I'm expecting them to answer me, okay? So we want to give them think time before we give an answer to a question, if we do that. And we want, again, our questions are directed so that they can engage personally with the story. We're trying to draw them in, right? That's the big idea, trying to draw them into the book. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I think should be the steps for reading and read aloud, and I'm going to do that with a book that I have already posted on our YouTube videos, and it's called Jabari Jumps. So I'm not actually going to read this story to you again. You can go and look at my read aloud, but I'm going to show you some things in this book that I did during that read aloud that refer to some of the things that I'm going to tell you about. So here are the steps that I would like to have you consider going through when you're doing a read aloud with kids. The first step is to introduce yourself. Sometimes I forgot to do that in my videos. I'm trying hard to do that. Introduce yourself. This is, again, if you're doing a video that you're recording. But if you're working with your kids directly in your distance learning, introduce the author and the illustrator. Okay, so we want to read the title of the book to the kids, but we don't want to forget to tell them who wrote the book and who illustrated the book. And in this case, the author and the illustrator are the same person. Okay, so we want to make sure that they're understanding. Those are called, the elements of the book. And if you have very, very young children, you might need to even begin by just sort of doing a book walkthrough, which is kind of where we sort of page through the book and we look at pictures first. We don't even read the story. We just say, oh, I wonder what's happening on this page. What do you think? And we just look at pictures and talk about maybe, oh, look, I think that little boy is swimming. Have you ever been swimming? What does swimming feel like? Oh, tell me, So we might just walk through the book. A book walk is what we call it. And for very young or very early language learners, so those kids who have just come and have very limited language, you might want to just go through a book walk and look at some pictures first, okay? We might talk about this is the back of the book and this is the cover, and this is how we read the book. This way, this is how it opens. So sometimes for very young learners, you go through that. I didn't do that with my story. But the next thing you want to do is make sure that you set a purpose for reading. Before we start reading, we want to engage our brains, right? Why am I reading this book? Well, what I want to help you understand is that we need to engage kids with two things. Background knowledge. What is it that they've done that might be similar, or how do they have a connection to what this character is going to do in the story? Have they ever been swimming? Have they ever been on a diving board? So those are the kinds of questions you might engage from the beginning to try to help them get ready to learn, get ready to think about this story, okay? We also could talk about the pictures that is on the front cover here and say, what's Jabari wearing? Oh, he has a bathing suit on and, oh, goggles. Why would he be wearing goggles? So these would be things that we might do to sort of, again, engage that reader, that listener, to get into this story. Ooh, I want to know. What's it going to be about? Okay? So we're setting the purpose for reading. I like to also say to them eventually, this story is about. So I want them to really, once we've done the questioning, like, who do you think the character is? Tell me more. What do you think it's going to be about? Where do you think this takes place? So we might talk a little bit about setting. We might talk about the character. We might talk about what the plot's going to be like. What do you think is going to happen in this story? Depends on what the cover, of course, offers you for those kinds of conversations. But we want to sort of set the tone that way. And then we want to make a statement so that they do have a clear understanding of what they're going to be reading about. This is going to be a story about a little boy who goes to a swimming pool. And he's going to be doing something very scary. Let's find out what it is. So we're going to set the tone. Let's see if you can find out what the scary thing is that this little boy is going to do. Okay, so that's setting the purpose for reading, making connections. Then we're going to start reading the story. And So we're asking questions before we read, while we're reading, and then when we're done. So before, during, and after. And the questions, again, back to that. Who, where, how, tell me more, did you ever? Those kinds of questions are always good for any of those circumstances. So we get through this, we get into the story here. And one of the questions I asked on this page, well, you see, you're able to observe the pool from this perspective. The illustrator does that. But then the illustrator has him climbing the ladder. And then eventually, he takes a little break and comes back the next day. The illustrator has this picture. So I explained to the kids what this is. Oh, this is Jabari on the top of the diving board, and he's looking down at all the kids. Why do you think the illustrator drew a picture like that for us? So then I pause, help them think about that a second. And then I say, maybe it's because the illustrator wants us to feel how high Jabari is, what it feels like to be Jabari standing so high on that diving board. Oh, can you feel that? What would that feel like? So again, trying to get them to be a part of the story. And then I talk about, oh, look what Jabari can see. What can he see from that far up? Okay, again, engaging. So this is a one where I had them read with me, splash. So anyway, lots of fun things you can do in a story, and just use your imagination and have fun with it. Oh, one of the things I've noticed is you got to make sure you're holding that book straight up or you can't see the pictures. And then at the very end, you might want to ask, what was the story mostly about? Can you tell me what the story was about again? For older readers, I think that's an appropriate question. For younger readers, you might say, what was your favorite part of the story? Another question for older readers that they're learning as one of the standards in school is, why do you think the author wrote this? So that's an author's purpose story. Do you think the author wrote it for fun, to inform us, or to persuade us, or change our minds, right? And then would you have written the ending the same, or would you have changed it? And tell me more. How would you have changed it? So those are maybe questions for older readers, but these are things that you could ask at the end of the story. Now, as you're going along, I want you to think about vocabulary words too, because it's really important to look through the book and make sure that that the children understand all of the vocabulary words. In this particular book, I was pretty confident that all of the words in here were words that our kids would know. They're pretty simple. So I didn't do an explicit vocabulary lesson, but you might find that there are some books where there are going to be some challenging words in there, and you might want to do an explicit vocabulary lesson before you even start the book. Maybe choose 3 to 5 important words that those kids are going to see again and again, and you can do an explicit lesson. I'm going to connect another video to this to show you what an explicit vocabulary lesson might look like, okay? The other way to teach vocabulary is to embed it in the story. So as you're reading the story and you come to a word that's difficult, then you restate that word in that sentence with a student-friendly definition, a definition the kids would understand right then and there. Now, I think it's really important too to use another sentence that would use that student-friendly definition in it. So in other words, or use the alternative word. Let's say we have a difficult word and we have another synonym that is more common. We'd want to use a sentence then, or that very sentence would be a good one. That very sentence, use that sentence again with the synonym that means the same. You want to give them that experience of using the challenging word in that sentence and the word that means the same, so they can begin to understand the meaning of that challenging word. So anyway, I'll embed add the video after this video, a couple of resources for you. I'll also put my notes onto this video, underneath the video, so that you have the things that I mentioned in print. So I hope that's helpful. Have fun.